Maybe since we're there, since I think we've got most people who've been waiting in the main room now, I'd like to welcome you to our panel today, which is called Intersecting Agendas, Gender and Disability Inclusive Peace Building at the United Nations. Next slide, please. I'm Deborah Steenstra, and I'll introduce myself more fully in a minute, but I wanted to go through a few housekeeping tasks to make sure that everyone can access this event in the way that they need to. Please note that we're recording this event so that we can make it available to those who are not able to attend. We have a human captioner, Laura, who will provide live, accurate captions. We suggest that you do not turn on the captions in Zoom or click on the Otter AI link at the top. Instead, we've provided a link to captioning in the chat to access this live captioning. As well, because typing in the chat can interfere with screen readers, we ask that you do not post into the chat unless you've been invited to do so. We will have time for question and answer and engagement at the end of the session. And at that time, you can post in the chat and also use the raise hand feature to ask a question. If you have a technical issue, please type a private chat to Meg Ingram using the drop-down list of names in the chat. Next slide, please. As I said, my name is Deborah Steenstra. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm honored to host today's conversation. I hold the Jaroslawski Chair in Families and Work, and I'm the director of the Live, Work, Well Research Center at the University of Guelph. I come to this conversation from years of advocacy and research bridging international commitments on women's and human and disability rights with local experiences in Canada. I also lead an international partnership called Engendering Disability Inclusive Development, Gendre, Handicap et Développement Inclusif, or as we call it, EDID-GEDI. We work on rights and justice with and for women and girls with disabilities in Canada, Vietnam, and Haiti, as well as transnationally. Please check out our work. The link to our website is on the slides you received, as well as in the chat. Next slide, please. I'd like to welcome each of you to this gathering from wherever you are around the world. And even in our panel, we span the globe. While the slides say I'm coming from Guelph, and that is where I usually am, and that's where the rest of my team is, I'm really coming to you from Fredericton in Canada, which is on the east coast of our country. These are the unceded territories and the traditional homeland of the Wolastoqey Nation since time immemorial. Their ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy and the Pescatawamacatee tribes and nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. And I often think of these peace and friendship treaties as a reminder that things don't always have to shift to conflict, but sometimes we can resolve things by building peace and friendship, although these did not always work out so well for the Indigenous peoples. We recognize the Indigenous peoples and their relationships with the land as an essential way to begin this conversation. I come as a settler and an immigrant to Canada, and I want to make explicit my and the Live, Work, Well Research Center's commitment to learn from and with Indigenous peoples, and to persistently insist on countering the effects of colonization, especially for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. Next slide, please. This panel is co-sponsored by two Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, funded projects, Finding Their Place, the Contributions of Women with Disabilities to Peace Building, and the EDID-GEDI partnership that I talked about. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Kirsten Van Houten for her role in organizing this event. In a moment, Kirsten will provide some context to the issues we'll be discussing today, based in part from her research project. Let me tell you a little bit more about how today's event will proceed. We are joined by 5 outstanding panelists. Their full bios are in the event website, which is linked, which the link is provided in the chat. A.H. Mongerol Kabir is the Senior United Nations Coordination Advisor and Global Team Leader for Gender Equality, Disability Inclusion, and Intersectionality at UN Women Headquarters in New York. Kirsten Lang is the Program Specialist on Disability Inclusive Humanitarian Action at UNICEF in Geneva. Janet E. Lord is the Executive Director of the Center for International and Comparative Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Bogna Ruminovic is the Chargé d'Affaires and ad interim of the Republic of Poland to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And Kirsten Van Houten is an assistant professor at the University of the Fraser Valley in the School of Social Justice and Global Stewardship. I'm always kind of impressed. This is a high level set of commentators, and I'm really excited about what they have to say. We're going to have 3 parts to our conversation. In the first 2 parts, I will ask each of the panelists to respond to a question. We will post both of those questions in the chat. In the third part, we'll invite you into the conversation in a question and answer session. We hope you can stay for the entire 90 minutes. So with that, we'll stop sharing the slides and I'll pass it along to Kirsten Van Houten, who will provide some background context on today's topic. Kirsten.
Thanks, Deborah. I'd like to start this morning, it's very early in the morning here in British Columbia, by acknowledging that both Langley, where I'm speaking from, and Abbotsford are on the traditional territories of the Stolo people, which are unceded. And I'd also like to start by thanking our panelists and members of the audience for participating today. And I would especially like to thank Dr. Deborah Steenstra and Lenore, especially from the EDID team, for the administrative and coordination support that they've provided for this event. Intersecting Agendas was conceived during the first phase of my SSHRC-funded research project, Finding Their Place. The larger project seeks to identify how women with disabilities contribute to peace building across peace building spaces at the local, national, regional, and international level. The first phase of this project engaged UN staff from a number of agencies and departments at headquarters in New York and at regional and national offices in Addis Ababa, where we discussed how the UN is integrating women with disabilities into peace building in policy and practice. It was undertaken with assistance from my research assistant, Fabian Garcia, who unfortunately was unable to attend today, but I wanted to acknowledge his contributions to this work. The research showed that there is a need for a broader understanding of the roles of women with disabilities in peace building and conflict, and a greater need for coordination across UN actors to ensure their full participation in these efforts. I hope that today's panel will offer a starting point for these discussions and collaborations. And that's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Kirsten, for providing that context. So as I said, we're going to do one set of questions first, and we'll go through each panelist and invite them to speak and an answer to that question for 5 minutes. And I warned them I'm a kind of firm timekeeper. But we've all agreed about how I can let them know when their time is finished. So the first question, and it will be posted as well in the chat, is describe how you engage disability and peace building in your work. How have women with disabilities been engaged in these activities specifically? And I'd like to start with Janet Lord. Janet, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Kirsten, for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. I am here in Baltimore, Maryland, and Baltimore, the lands here that where I am, we're home to the Nanacote, the Assateagues, the Piscataway, and other indigenous peoples. And I learned very little about that history in my early education. So trying to do a redo of that, notwithstanding current efforts to sanitize American history. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, and I will start by saying that the story that I'm going to tell about women with disabilities and peace building starts way back at the time, very appropriately, because we've got so many wonderful Canadians on the line here. It starts for me in the landmines movement. So the landmines movement, which of course produced the Landmine Treaty, the Ottawa Convention. I came to full-time disability rights work and advocacy into that process with an organization that was focused on the rights of landmine survivors. And so we were busy at the late 90s monitoring the implementation of the Mine Ban Treaty and focusing on the rights of survivors. The folks who were running the organization that I was a part of and that I came into were realizing that there were significant gaps, that if one focused purely, and exclusively on, access to rehabilitation, but did so in a context where landmine survivors were excluded on the basis of disability in many aspects of life, then we weren't probably going to get very far. So there was a feeling and a sense that rights-based advocacy was going to be very important. And even in the Mine Ban Treaty process itself, the rights of landmine survivors were not exactly front and center. They were very much at the margins of the intercessional meetings and the yearly meetings that were happening. And it really took advocates some effort to make sure that what is called victim assistance was made part of the process. And that really was the work of survivors and also allies to make that happen. And so in my early days with the landmines community and landmine survivor organizations, I hasten to add that all of the landmine networks, the survivor networks that we were working with around the world were, not surprising, run by men. The founders of our organization were men. Interestingly, most of the people doing the hard work were women. It's not new in the nonprofit community. And it was very interesting because I was told at the time that really most landmine survivors were men, not women. I later came to meet a number of women landmine survivors, but that was peculiar. But it may have been that male landmine survivors had greater access to services. Perhaps, I don't know. We never really sorted that out. But soon after I joined the community of landmine survivors, an interesting thing happened. Mexico, out of the blue, initiated the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities treaty process. And that really started off a much more concerted effort to think about women with disabilities in peace building, in development, in human rights advocacy. And many of the women in the CRPD process, the treaty process, were women leaders with disabilities from conflict-affected countries, from countries who had, South Africa emerged from apartheid and so forth. So it really was at the beginning of that process that we started to see women with disabilities leading their own delegations and becoming part of that process. So that was, I'll say more later, but that was really the beginning of a sense that women with disabilities were very much engaged and doing amazing work at the grassroots level and taking that to the international stage to advance the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great introduction. And it's dear to my heart, that Landmines Treaty, because my partner at the time worked for Disabled Peoples International on that very treaty. So it's part of my history too. Manjurul, Kabir, I'd like to invite you next to answer the question, describe how you engage disability and peace building in your work. How have women with disabilities been engaged in these activities specifically? Manjurul, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that initiative, and as colleagues before me set the tone, I'll just highlight a couple of issues, also to evoke perhaps a little bit of more questions. Now, you did start at the beginning that there are three layers where you looked at global, then you looked at regional, then of course your country level. And I was looking at how we within UN Women and broader UN system are addressing both intersectionality and disability inclusion to the extent that we can capture some of the essential part, not only essential participation, but secure their effective leadership and role. And one of the reasons why we had to do a global knowledge product on intersectionality, we realized that we are not only United Nations, but also member states. Countries after countries are very good when they are addressing one specific challenges, one set of vulnerability, one set of leave no one behind. But the moment you speak about rural women with disability, or women with disability and LGBTIQ, or ethnic minority with disability, it becomes challenging for government, local government, and also how the UN system would respond. And this becomes further challenging when you are dealing with conflict and peace building, because then really the space is so limited. So at the global level, I will just respond to your questions within the timeline. Is the challenge is not only about participation of women with disabilities in the international peace process, negotiation process, and peace building initiative, because this is not about reasonable accommodation, accessibility, although that creates a lot of obstacles and challenges across the global processes, but how Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325 can connect better with Security Council Resolution on 2475, which is the only resolution on the conflict, person with disability and conflict, and thereby we can raise the issues and profile of women with disability. At the regional level, we are seeing a lot more movement. I'll just give one example where UN Women is working really well with a few other UN agencies. After the Ukraine war broke out, one of the immediate challenges we face is women with disabilities who cross the border of Ukraine and in the neighboring countries in Moldova. Some went to even Georgia and other few countries. What are the response of the host country with women with disabilities, and how this women's voice matters as the whole peace process is in tatter, or there are voices that is important in terms of whatever international negotiation happening. Same goes with in other parts, in Palestine, in Gaza, and everywhere, for women's voices. I personally was in Afghanistan and used to cover in Somalia and a number of other conflict countries where I haven't seen, and the women with disabilities is always the last thought. It's because of the lack of outreach and because of the lack of resources that was dedicated for them, because it was never seen as a priority by the countries in a security situation where they think that this is something we need to prioritize as well. And then, of course, when I look at a few other countries where we are working well on this aspect, for example, I'll give you an example in Colombia, where the whole peace negotiation was happening. UN Women was connecting with also IOM and Peace Building Fund and trying to make sure that integration of international standards of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence are part of the peace response that's being discussed and the sort of integrated. Secondly, we're looking at it also in Ethiopia, where UN Women in collaboration with African Women Leaders Network are trying to connect that, making sure that the forum in Ethiopia raise the broader response in the Central Africa and a number of other African countries marred by conflict, but absolutely no scene of women with disabilities in some of the responses. Some of the responses is gaining ground. For example, in some of the countries where the rural area are critical challenges on the conflict line, UN Women has managed to work with local governance. So that's why it is important when we talk about peace building, we don't centralize it. We also talk about decentralized government functionaries who often are not even invited when there are peace negotiations taking place, and always this Central Ministry of Defense, Interior, presidential administration part of it, but never before the elected decentralized governments representatives are there. It is important they are there because they can also connect with rural women with disabilities in the peace building process, what the often I found most forgotten part. And then lastly, what other one of the interesting data I would like to share, we're looking at also women, peace and security and national aspect in the national strategy for women, peace and security. It is true that disability is not necessarily in the space where we would like to see them, but it is gaining traction. That is the positive news. Many countries are now prioritizing as part of women, peace and security, and they're looking at more intersectional lens so that disability and other aspects are also captured. And that is where I think we have to invest more. And we have to also look at the whole issue of disability inclusion and accessibility that creates the prohibition or obstruction to the participation become a part of normal response, in addition to when we really discuss about the broader political issue in terms of their political voice and agency. Now that voice and agency,
I'm going to have to. Thank you so much, Moncheryl.
Thank you very much.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for setting up that global, regional, and country-based approach to thinking about women with disabilities in peace building and giving some really clear examples, and then reminding us again that it's also about intersectionality and using an accessibility and disability inclusion lens. So thank you very much for that. Kirsten Lang, may I turn it over to you to describe how you engage disability and peace building in your work, and how have women with disabilities been engaged in these activities specifically? Go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join the session today. I've been really looking forward to it. So we already know about the correlation between gender inequality and interstate conflict, but this meeting is particularly important because the intersection between gender and disability in this context has rarely received attention. In peace building, UNICEF works to address horizontal inequalities. So these are the systems of exclusion that produce unequal access to power, to resources, and to opportunities. And these are really amongst the strongest predictors of conflict. So addressing these structural drivers of exclusion through inclusive and equitable access to services is one of the strongest levers that we have to address the root causes of fragility and conflict. And this means understanding not just who is being left behind, but also why. So really building an equity and inclusion lens into everything that we do. We see that the relationship between people and their communities and institutions is crucial for peace. So in this regard, UNICEF addresses disability inclusion and gender equality in our 4 peace-building levels of engagement. So I'm going to briefly take us through those 4 levels, but focusing really on how we engage girls with disabilities, given that we're coming from the child rights perspective. So the first of those levels of engagement is to create an enabling environment for child rights-based and positive peace. So for UNICEF, this is about changing the social norms and the stigma that keep women and girls with disabilities excluded. So for example, in Colombia, UNICEF supported dialogue on peace through safe spaces for adolescents. And youth with disabilities co-created community activities that promoted inclusion and supported the reduction of stigma. The second level of engagement, state-society relations. So this is really the area of work around connecting the state with local communities. And an example I can share is from the Solomon Islands, where an upcoming peace-building program will be supporting constitutional reform and governance restructuring. And in this initiative, we're ensuring to apply a gender equality, disability, and social inclusion lens, ensuring that people with disabilities are engaged in consultations, in outreach, and in civic education. We're also, for example, committing to ensuring the collection of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. Now, the third level of engagement, community relationships. This is about relationships within and among population groups in the community. And an example I can share here is from South Sudan, where UNICEF supported inclusive peace clubs in schools and in child-friendly spaces with participation by children with disabilities. Now, to ensure inclusion, for example, Monjurul mentioned accessibility. Sign language interpreters and peer support was provided so that deaf and blind children could take part in the dialogues on conflict resolution. Children with disabilities themselves also co-led campaigns against violence and contributed to reconciliation messages through drama, through storytelling and art. I'd be happy to share more examples on this in the Q&A if we have time. But moving on to the fourth element, which is to develop individual capacities for peace. So this is around supporting individuals to engage in inclusive social change processes. And here I can share an example from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where UNICEF supported interethnic peace-building camps. Now, these brought together children from different ethnic groups, including those with disabilities. All the activities were made accessible, and youth with disabilities, for example, were assigned to do peer mentorship and be co-facilitators. So again, taking that lead role themselves. If I have time for one more, I do not. So thank you.
No, you do. You have
super.
1 minute left.
1 minute, super. So maybe just one more example on this individual capacities for peace, which is I think is a nice example. Is where UNICEF invested $10 million across 11 countries to support girl-led decision-making and advocacy in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And this was really to ensure that adolescent girls could influence the programs and the policies affecting their lives. In this initiative, we're actively promoting participation by adolescent girls with disabilities. And this is such as through, for example, establishing adolescent advisory groups, which also include girls with disabilities. So thank you. Happy to share more examples in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I was really taken by these 4 levels of building peace and the examples that you gave, that real sense of it's a holistic approach where we work in different ways to change, to build change both in people and in the structures in which they live. So thank you very much for sharing that work of UNICEF and your own work on that. Thank you. May I turn now to Bogna Ramonovic? I'm going to get it right one of these days, Bogna. My last name is often one people struggle with, and so I'm sharing in that struggle. I've got how to say it. Maybe you can tell me how you say it, and then I can echo back it. But may I invite you to also speak to how you engage disability and peace building in your work, and how have women with disabilities been engaged in these activities specifically? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Bogna Raminovic, so you got it almost perfectly. I hope everyone can hear me well. As I was introduced, I'm currently chargé d'affaires of the Polish embassy here in Buenos Aires, but I'm going to speak about my experience from my previous posting that was New York, where I had the privilege to negotiate the resolution 2475 of the Security Council. That was the first resolution dedicated to persons with disabilities in the conflict and in the humanitarian crisis. So I'm going to present you a bit of the resolution, that it's still the only one dedicated to that issue, and also looking at that through more of gender lens. So maybe starting by saying that until June 2019, when the resolution has been adopted, the Security Council has paid rather little attention to the persons with disabilities in general, not to mention women with disabilities. There have been only 2 rather small references in the context-specific resolutions to the situation of persons with disabilities. That has changed significantly with the adoption of the resolution. Of course, that was also linked to bit of a change that happened in general in the United Nations, with UNDIS, with all the activities that mentioned already by the colleagues from UNICEF, by UN Women. However, looking very clearly at the Security Council, that was definitely a breakthrough in the work of the Council. When we have negotiated the resolution, it has the idea was that it would be a foundation for more resolutions to come and more of different focuses in the past. That's why this one, it's more of a general in its nature. It does reference women and girls, applies gender perspective in some way, but in general, it sets the scene, and it's a basis for further work in the Council. What we wanted to achieve with the Council, especially, is the strengthening data collection and reporting on persons with disabilities in the conflict, and that, of course, it's also very important looking at the specific challenges of women or girls in this context. The other thing is that we've seen there was still very little knowledge or sensitivity among peacekeepers and peace builders when it comes to the rights and needs of persons with disabilities in this specific context. And furthermore, what is probably even more important and relevant to this conversation is that although we presented the resolution as part of the protection of civilians agenda, the idea was very much to shift the attitude from looking at persons with disabilities in the conflict from only the humanitarian assistance perspective and protection to empowerment and engagement with persons with disabilities. That also includes women with disabilities in the process, and also as partners in the work of the Security Council. That it's still something that we would love to see more progress, and I'm also working with, although I'm now a bit further away from the topic, I'm still working with my colleagues in other member states to make sure that this is still high on the agenda. The other issues that the resolution sets as a basis is also the equal access to humanitarian assistance and services that tends to be particularly important for women, and especially for women, also girls, that they are very often the very last to receive assistance, and they face additional barriers in reaching shelters, clinics, reaching distribution points. And very often it's the woman who would be responsible for providing food, shelter for the family. And of course, protection from violence, from abuse, where women and girls face a higher risk of conflict-related sexual violence, trafficking, exploitation. And addressing their situation requires specific measures, and the Survivor Center response that would also recognize the gender and disability lens. Which, as I have mentioned, that was not the isolated achievement, that it came together with significant developments in the UN system in general. And we've seen that with time, the issues of persons with disabilities, so women with disabilities, have also been more present in other discussions in the Council and beyond, in general in the Security Council. So had been discussed at length by the Conference of State Parties of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of which the Article 11 is very much dedicated to that matter. I still think
I'm going to ask you to hold the rest of your comments until your next answer, if that's okay. Thank you so much for your advocacy in ensuring that this resolution was created and adopted within the United Nations system. I know how often having those resolutions as a focal point and as a set of commitments allows various people to be able to mobilize activity. So I think you've really illustrated where some of the complexities of implementing, both getting the resolution, but then implementing it in a variety of different ways have been ongoing since the resolution was adopted. So thank you. And last on this question, I'm going to turn to Kirsten Van Houten. Kirsten, can you describe how you engage disability and peace building in your work, and how have women with disabilities been engaged in these activities specifically?
Thank you. So I wanted to start by providing some context for my research project and also the starting place for my discussion of women with disabilities in peace building. Then I'm going to move on to talk about some of the broader implications of this particular body of research. The initial research design for finding their place sought to examine contributions of women with disabilities in North and South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I had to shift this research design because of ongoing armed conflict in the Eastern DRC, as well as a broader reading of the academic literature and policy landscape when I started this project about a year ago. However, this initial focus on the Democratic Republic of the Congo was inspired by the fact that my doctoral research incidentally identified several staff at local peacebuilding organizations who had mental health disabilities or who suffered from chronic illnesses. There may have been more participants with disabilities beyond those who identified themselves, but had not included disability as a demographic indicator in my initial research. The participants who did identify as having disabilities described an absence of structural support for their disabilities within their organizations. And of particular interest, none of the organizations offered psychosocial support to their staff, despite their regular exposure to both primary and secondary trauma. When I've spoken with representatives from DPO as part of this particular project, I have heard over and over again about the significant need to address mental health and psychosocial support for peace builders on the ground, for members of armed groups who are demobilizing, and others. And I wanted to highlight this in the local peace building setting as well. My doctoral research also documented the use of a social model for disability at the Panzi Hospital in South Kivu, which offers treatment and support to the victims of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. In addition to providing medical care for survivors, the Panzi Foundation also offers legal, psychosocial, and socioeconomic support, including livelihoods training to the women that they serve. During the course of my research, I also encountered women who had been served by the hospital who, upon returning to their communities, had set up networks and associations to support other survivors of this prevalent form of violence, which can lead to lasting disability and help to support a community of care and to promote peace in the areas where they lived. Conducting my postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Steenstra and the members of the EDID partnership also created an opportunity for me to more meaningfully engage with these findings and consider how local peacebuilding agency is exercised by women with disabilities. By participating in the partnership, I met women and men with disabilities from South Africa, Vietnam, Uganda, Haiti, and Canada who contribute to peacebuilding, community building, and development through academic research, legal work, community projects, public speaking, and other avenues locally, nationally, and internationally. I have not commenced the second phase of my research, which more directly seeks to identify and describe the contributions of women with disabilities to peacebuilding at the local level. I think it's important to recall that women with disabilities are also employed across the UN, including in roles under the Peace and Security pillar, and were among participants in my study. In fact, I heard from staff associated with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy that the UN is seeking to position itself as an employer of choice for persons with disabilities. I think that this is an important reminder that women with disabilities are actively engaging in peace and security as staff at the UN and emphasize the need to move away from imagining women with disabilities primarily as recipients of
You have 1 minute
assistance.
left.
It's okay, I'm wrapping up. We're
Okay,
at the
1 minute.
and who are actively participating in peace building at the peace and security pillar. Thanks.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you in mid-stride there. Thank you, Kirsten, for telling us a bit of history of your important research, both in your doctoral work, but also in your postdoctoral work and in the project still to come. And I know this event wouldn't have happened without your research. So thank you for that. I was also really interested in making the links you're making about an absence of structural supports for staff who are doing frontline work, where the creation of the disabling creation of mental health disabilities maybe not recognized or supported, and the links to gender-based violence were important. And then I think also the links to the United Nations desire to be an employer of choice for people with disabilities is a great opportunity. So thank you. Wow, didn't we go through a lot in that? I mean, we went from landmines to United Nations and many places in between. In our second question, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these issues. So for each participant, we're asking the following question. In their article, Greater Than Nothing, which is still in process, it's not yet published, Kirsten Van Houten and Fabian Garcia have documented that the engagement of women with disabilities in United Nations peacebuilding efforts have been ad hoc and do not reflect an extension of the international inclusivity norm to this group, to women and girls with disabilities. So the question is, what are the challenges to engaging women with disabilities in peacebuilding and humanitarian action? And how do you imagine their full and meaningful participation in these processes could be facilitated in the future? So I'm going to go in the same order, although I'm not sure Montreal was able to stay with us. I'm going to ask each speaker to speak for about 5 minutes. Janet, may I start with you?
Sure. Thank you for that. Great listening to everyone. So when we started negotiating the CRPD at the UN, we had a couple of barriers. One, the UN itself was not accessible. And we were, so that was a problem, and it's changed quite a bit since then, in part because of the work of women with disabilities to advocate for greater access. But we also knew that we were confronting really at least 3 domains of exclusion. Number one, the UN human rights system itself. It had been clearly documented that it was not engaging on disability issues, and neither were organizations of people with disabilities engaging much in the UN human rights system. Secondly, there was a lack of engagement in humanitarian action, and third, lack of engagement, and not, we couldn't speak of anything in the sense of disability inclusive development. So we knew we were up against a lot. And I point to a really foundational and very important effort during the CRPD process, which was to ensure that both age and gender were reflected throughout the text. And so women with disabilities insisted, and particularly those from Korea, initially insisted on a gender article, an article specifically on women with disabilities, and to make sure that the entirety of the convention was read through a gender lens. And then secondly, the effort again by many women with disabilities, many from conflict-affected countries like Yemen, insisting that we have an Article 11 in the treaty that dealt not only with protection in natural disasters, which were actually unfolding while we were negotiating the treaty and around the world, but also in the context of armed conflict. So we have Article 11 that gives us that door opener. And then hence, the other bookend of that is Security Council Resolution 2475. So with those really important developments, it was became possible to really talk about how are we thinking about integrating disability into the women, peace and security work that the UN was already doing, and how can we think about disability inclusion in humanitarian action, in international humanitarian law, etc. I had the opportunity to work for Gerard Quinn, who served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as his legal counsel. And he did 3 successive reports on gender, on peace building, disability and peace building. And we worked hard to integrate a gender lens in those 3 different reports. It wasn't always easy, and we didn't have a whole lot to go on because, indeed, as the findings of this research show, it's been a bit ad hoc. But I think Gerard's intention and the intention of me and my colleagues who are working actively on research at the Harvard Project on Disability was to really look at the implications of the CRPD for intersectionality, and intersectionality also across different regimes of international law. So looking at disability and international criminal law, disability in the context of DDR programming, looking at the extent to which commissions of inquiry and fact-finding bodies of the UN have addressed disability, including women with disabilities and intersectional issues. So we've tried to help seed that work a little bit through our research, and we continue to be active at the level of the UN. One of the things I'll be doing in a couple of weeks is speaking before the first committee of the UN General Assembly on a really interesting initiative to get that committee to look more closely at disability issues and intersectionality as well. So, you know, it's been a long haul, but I think we have made some progress, and that's been thanks to work by people like Rosemary Case, who's on the CRPD committee, with whom I'm working along with other members of the committee on a general comment, an interpretive comment on Article 11 of the treaty, through research that's trying to highlight that people with disabilities are and should be involved in all spaces in decision making as well. And then finally, through the current effort, the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, that's finally getting underway at the UN, reminding folks that people with disabilities were persecuted on the basis of disability. That was recognized at Nuremberg, but international criminal law has lagged behind, even though there's been a lot of work being done on gender in the context of international criminal law, not gender disability together with international criminal law. So that's a recent effort that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. I appreciate so much the range of new initiatives that you've pointed us to, as well as ongoing levers and norms that are places where we can push Article 11 in the CRPD, as well as Security Council Resolution 2475. But then the new pieces that you're talking about, looking at how the First Committee of the United Nations General Assembly could be looking more specifically at disability, and over the long haul. I was really interested to hear about a new interpretive comment of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on Article 11 and the issue of crimes against humanity, which I've read about in your work and think that that's so important to recognize. So thank you for those. Kirsten Lang, may I turn it over to you? Because I think Monterol's not back. Speaking of the United Nations, he got pulled away on that. But Kirsten Lang, can I invite you to answer this second question about the challenges to engaging women with disabilities in peace building and humanitarian action, and how can we facilitate their full and meaningful participation in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we've seen, as you know, I'm co-chairing the Disability Reference Group, so I have a very strong focus on humanitarian action. And over the last few years, we've really seen a lot of progress on disability inclusive humanitarian action, although even here much still remains to be done. But I thought it might be interesting to just reflect for 5 minutes on what has been learned from this experience so far and how that can be applied to peace building. So in this regard, I've identified 3 key lessons. The first one being that meaningful participation is not just about creating space. So at the most basic practical level, we know that meaningful participation requires accessibility. Now, this is very basic, but I still see it being so often overlooked with, for example, global meetings with no access for wheelchair users, online consultations without captioning or sign, community engagement processes with no proactive outreach to women and girls with disabilities, etc. Secondly, meaningful participation requires shared learning and connections and not just training. As an example of this, as the Disability Reference Group, we bring together organisations of persons with disabilities and humanitarian actors and have created a space there for joint learning, joint collaboration and the development of relationships between OPDs and humanitarian actors rather than that one-way, one-directional training. Meaningful participation also requires resourcing. Up until quite recently, what we saw in the humanitarian space was that if OPDs are engaged at all, they're often not reimbursed for their time or even for the costs that they incur through participating, like transport, childcare, lost wages, etc. And we do know that OPDs have higher operational costs due to accessibility requirements. So we're only now starting to see this shift with more emphasis on equal partnerships and a shift in funding to OPDs. And then lastly, meaningful participation, it fundamentally requires an attitude shift. So for women with disabilities to be viewed as real partners with unique and valuable contributions and not merely as recipients of humanitarian assistance. Now, the second key lesson I would pull out is that what is not counted is not visible. So we've really seen that data makes inclusion explicit and it makes it deliberate. But we've also seen that having data on disability is often an uphill battle. There's very commonly a perception of this being high cost, being technically difficult, or even being unnecessary. So how in the humanitarian space have we been tackling this? Firstly, it's about being really clear about what data is needed for what purpose and not just talking about blanket disaggregation. So, for example, looking at how do we understand who is included and who is excluded? How are people being impacted? What are the barriers to participation? And this requires both quantitative and qualitative data. So we might like to ask ourselves what data exactly is needed to improve participation by women and girls with disabilities in peace building. Secondly, to address the challenges with data, we've learned that we need to build disability data into broader processes and systems rather than this being standalone. So as an example from the humanitarian space, we worked together with OCHA and other key actors to ensure that there is now a requirement in the humanitarian needs and response planning templates for disaggregation of data on populations in need by disability. What we've seen is that as a result of this, data is now being collected and used systematically. So we might want to look at what are the entry points in peace building processes and systems. We've also learned that for data collection to be effective, it needs to be accompanied by tools and resources. I see I have a short amount of time left, so I'm going to leave data aside and go on to the third and final lesson, which is that dedicated funding is what makes the difference in moving the needle. Inclusion doesn't need to be expensive, but it does require investment. We saw, for example, a number of years ago, the Central Emergency Response Fund under underfunded emergencies window allocated a dedicated funding pool of $10 million for disability inclusion. So how can we effectively use funding instruments for peace building to enable participation by women with disabilities? Stop there, hopefully still within time.
Thank you. Oh, you're perfect. So disciplined. Thank you. You make my job easy. And I'm quite moved by your recognition of the different aspects of what can be learned and the recognition of the knowledge and the experience of women with disabilities to the different places, and how accessibility and meaningful participation requires both recognizing that knowledge and ensuring that participation can happen by having data, resources, and attitude shift. So thank you very much for that. Bogna, may I turn it over to you for your answer to what do you think are some of the challenges to engaging women with disabilities in peace building, and how can their meaningful participation be facilitated?
No, good. Thank you very much. Well, my first point was also about the data, but I fully agree what has been said before, so I'm not going to repeat much, but definitely we do need disability and gender disaggregated data to design effective and inclusive way of engaging women and girls. So I think that's absolutely a fundamental challenge. The other thing is, I believe that still women with disabilities tend to be involved in rather symbolic processes than being part of the core discussions. That applies both to the peace negotiation on the ground and related processes, as well as discussions in the UN, in the Security Council, at the Third Committee, at the Conference of State Parties. We have great discussions that also thanks to a lot of work of the Special Rapporteur that has been already mentioned, and the committee, that I think that there is the growing understanding among experts that deal with human rights, that are gender experts, and they don't need to be convinced anymore probably about the important role of women and girls. However, then when we talk about more sensitive political issues, those aspects tend to be omitted. They no longer are important, and then probably within the UN, as well as within the systems of the member states that engage in all the discussions, there is a clear division between what is more of a human rights angle to this discussion and what are the real political challenges. And I think breaking this kind of silences that we still work in and see things, and seeing inclusiveness of the peace processes as something still less important in a way that doesn't need to be addressed in a more systematic way. I think it's something that it's definitely very important. We've seen over the years lots of events also at the Security Council dedicated to persons with disabilities in general, as well as women with disabilities, or in general dedicated to the woman in the context of peace and security, but that was somehow always separate from the core work of the council. And I think shifting this attitude is something that definitely needs to be addressed, that we no longer see it as something additional, but as a key component. I think there has been already enough research that proves how much including of different groups of the society makes the peace processes much more durable. The other thing is also I would see the need to bring more bridges between different agendas in the UN. We heard also an example from UNICEF, but how the agendas of children armed conflict, youth peace and security, women peace and security have all worked together and having the disability lens. So it's not something that it's only discussed in the dedicated meetings. Definitely what is still lacking is a real partnership with local organizations that could be organizations of persons with disabilities, of women with disabilities, that could also shape the decisions that are being taken, that it's not only there are symbolic meetings, but rather really seeing their role in setting the standards, promoting, also amplifying more voices of women with disabilities with strong experience in peace processes that can serve as role examples. It's something that it's also can serve as an inspiration.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Bogna, any last
Point.
sentence there to close up?
No, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for reinforcing the importance of shifting from inclusion in symbolic processes to more substantive ways, and building bridges between different parts of the United Nations, as well as building partnerships with civil society organizations who are representative of women with disabilities. So thank you for those important points. Kirsten Van Houten, the last word on this question to you. What do you see are some of the challenges to engaging women with disabilities in peace building? And how do you imagine their full participation and meaningful participation could be facilitated?
Excellent. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that it's come to that time in a Zoom call when my dog has had enough and is now sitting on my lap. For everyone watching, this is Moby. So I wanted to sort of use my time here as a way to tie everything together that we've heard so far today. And I identified from my own research what we heard were the most common challenges and perhaps a path forward in terms of the inclusion of women with disabilities in peace building. And I'd like to acknowledge that we've heard a lot about the challenges that I already had listed here, so I'm just going to go through them quickly, and I'm going to then move to the opportunities. So we've heard from the other panelists, unsurprisingly, because it was the issue that came up the most often in our research, that there's a lack of meaningful data on the participation of women with disabilities in peace building and humanitarian spaces. And that has an impact on the ability to design and implement programs. The second challenge that we heard the most often was the lack of existing funding group for women with disabilities in peace building. And so that limits the ability to design and implement programming specifically around that. Third, we heard about reporting guidelines and application processes, which are too onerous for disabled persons and women's organizations to meet, recognizing that sometimes there is a capacity or a funding gap in the ability to meet those strenuous requirements. And then the fourth issue, which has come out in drips and drops in this conversation, but I think it's good to take head on, is the current global political environment. And that's an environment in which the discussion of gender and disability, as well as other topics related to equity, diversity and inclusion, are increasingly being attacked. It's an environment in which several participants in this research reported that women in general, or that the UN was not meeting its targets for ensuring that women in general were being included in peace building processes and peace negotiations. And it's a political environment in which funding is narrowing for all projects, which presents challenges for everyone moving forward. In terms of opportunities, and this is in the policy brief that I circulated from our work, we again identified 4 opportunities. The first is creating a dual track approach, which would include both conducive policy environment, and individual supports to facilitate that full participation of women with disabilities in UN-led peacebuilding efforts. Second, although we heard from the other Kirsten that we need to move beyond education and training, a number of participants in this research who didn't work directly on this issue, even knowing that there are HR training modules on the topic, felt that they still needed more education and training on this particular topic to meaningfully implement it into their work. Third, someone suggested the creation of designated funds within the UN Peacebuilding Fund, which could draw from the 30% of that fund, which is already designated for gender-specific projects, to be more specifically targeted to the inclusion of women with disabilities. And finally, they identified the need for more inclusive monitoring and evaluation activities, which could aid with that data collection process. And I think I was well within my 5 minutes, so good. And I am looking forward to a lively question and answer period.
Wonderful. Yes, you were well within your 5 minutes. And thank you for just also sharing the results of your research and the recommendations that you've made in the policy brief. And everybody who registered should have received that policy brief. And if not, we can share it with you. Or if you don't have access to it, we can share it with you again. Just write to us at EDID, at the EDID email that you wrote to initially. So thank you all for that amazing set of ways forward. What we'd like to do now is to open up the conversation to the audience, to those of you online. We have about 15 minutes. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up this really, really interesting conversation. You can tell I'm quite engaged with it. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and participating in this discussion about emerging inclusion of women with disabilities in United Nations peacebuilding policies and practices. We hope that you've gained some insights about some of the specific challenges, as well as some of the practical and visionary solutions to engage meaningful participation and inclusion of women and girls with disabilities. I'd like to thank the panelists, all of them, for sharing their knowledge and experiences in really engaging ways. And as well, I'd like to thank those of you who've been working behind the scenes to make this happen. First and foremost, Kirsten Van Houten for the idea, the execution, everything in between. Fabian Garcia, who wasn't able to be here, but was a key part of it. Lenore Lara, who's been the main administrative person behind it, Catherine Hall, Meg Ingram, Sharon Finley, Benedict Hughes, who've all been part of making this a smooth event online, and our caption, Laura Slicka. Laura's been on multiple of our pieces, and she's always been a real support, so thank you for that. We'd like to invite you to our next event, the Live Work Well Research Center's next event on November the 10th, which is part of our Countering Policy Exclusions. It will be hybrid, and it's going to be on leading in policies and politics, women and girls with disabilities. And we're delighted to have a robust panel of Canadian and Barbadian experts. We'll have Carrie-Anne Eiffel from Barbados, who will be visiting Guelph at that point in time. So you can get more information at our website, liveworkwell.ca, and the link is in the chat. If you're interested in learning more about the EDID Getty partnership or being more involved in our activities, please visit our website. And again, the contact information is in the link. Thank you all for being part of this, and especially thank you to the panelists for your insights and wisdom.